Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the bonus stage, Midwest Gaming Classic 2021. Woo! It's actually happening.
Let's hear ya.
Hey, I like your enthusiasm. All right. This ain't your first row. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our first official panel of Midwest Gaming Classic 2021. I would like to introduce to you Mr. Ethan Johnson. He's going to let us know about Dave Nutting.
Yes.
A man who's not from Wisconsin, but lived in Wisconsin long enough to be from Wisconsin.
Yes.
All right. Take it away, Ethan. Let's give it up for Ethan, everybody.
Woo! All right, Milwaukee. How are we doing today? Fantastic. So today we're going to talk about a great departed arcade designer. His name is David Nutting. Probably one of the most important designers you probably haven't heard of. Now, if you have heard the name Nutting before, it's probably because you know this guy right here, Bill Nutting. He's the guy who helped Nolan Bushnell and Tab Dabney launch Computer Space. But his brother Dave, they are brothers, helped launch so many other things. And he is one of the great inventors in the video game space. So let's talk a bit about his illustrious career. So Bill and Dave were born to a rather well-off family. This is a home they bought during the Depression era, so they were pretty well off, and that's going to play a part in this story here. So Dave was born January 28th, 1930. He was the third brother. I believe Dave was the oldest, so the first and the third brothers Nutting. And they had acquired their wealth from being buyers in department goods stores. And the parents really encouraged their kids to also go into that business track. But Dave wasn't that kind of guy. Dave here was an inquisitive engineer from a very early age. Some stories he likes to tell include him taking apart the family toaster and then putting it back together before anyone knew anything was wrong with it. And also taking apart an outboard motor while it was still hot, so he couldn't put it back together again. But over time, he got out of his parents' shadow and started down the path of doing science and engineering. But very particularly, he discovered about a year into his college years this thing called industrial design. For those who don't know what industrial design is, it's the look and feel of a certain product. Right here, I have the industrial design specs for the arcade game Gauntlet here. So it's the cabinet design, the exterior, the way that people interface with it. And Dave just found this very, very interesting. He wanted to do this for mass market products. So he decided to go into industrial design. And after he had finished his college, he decided to join up with a Milwaukee area firm called Brooks Stevens Design Associates. They were famous for quite a number of things. They did all kinds of general stuff. They did pots and pans and motors and all this sort of thing, but they were also pretty big for cars. And very particularly, Dave Nutting was a designer of one of their big defining products. Dave Nutting did the industrial design on the Jeep Grand Wagoneer, which is considered one of the very first SUVs. There's a whole story behind that, a bit of conviction and being able to overcome the doubts of others, and yeah, the inspirational story. But basically, this means that Dave Nutting was an industrial designer of some note. And this came into play when his brother Bill needed something fixed. So Bill Nutting had gone into business, and he had got into investing in these things called teaching machines, which were these electromechanical devices that had a strip of film inside, and it would run through questions, and people could answer, and they changed this into a coin-operated game right here called the Knowledge Computer. So Bill Nutting had been running this for several years, but this device, if you can see it right here, it's kind of clunky, right? It's not really something you would want to go straight up to as someone in the arcade. Well, it's not really an arcade game per se, but it was a coin-operated game. So they needed a more rugged exterior, more appealing exterior. And the internals needed to be redesigned as well. So Bill came to Dave, though Bill says Dave came to him. There's a whole story behind this. We're not going to get too far into this. And he wanted it redesigned. But as I said, Dave was just an exterior designer. He wasn't an engineer. He knew a little bit of stuff, but he couldn't do it himself. So he got a friend of his named Harold Montgomery to help him with the internal redesign and make this a more solid product. So they started working on this redesign, and they flew out to see Bill in California, and Bill didn't want to work with them. It's a whole story, a whole thing. Not going to get into that right now, but the redesign of this quiz game was no longer on the table. So Dave and Harold were kind of in a muss here because they were going to start manufacturing this. They had parts prepared. They were preparing a facility. They were going to manufacture it there, and then Bill was going to sell it. So they're already in the hole, so like, I guess we should just make our own quiz game. And so they did. So they made a game called IQ Computer. They got this other guy named Gene Wagner to help them out as a sales guy. And they started pushing their game at the same time that Bill was pushing his game, which he went to another firm to redesign called Computer Quiz. And they set up their facilities in 3404 North Holton Street here in Milwaukee. You can still see it today, though I think the roof design exterior has been sort of torn down and whatnot. But this is how it looked back in the 70s, though right now we're talking about 1967. So these quiz games start doing really well. They're kind of this interesting niche in the late 60s arcade where you can put them in places that you wouldn't normally put arcade games because they're kind of educational. So they made a couple of custom ones, like this golf one here. But the quiz game market, it's a fad. It kind of falls apart rather quickly. They start trying to go into actual teaching machines, not really being in the coin-op industry. Doesn't work out for them. So they decide they have to rejigger what they're doing. They have to take the technology that they're using within these quiz games with film and coin devices and whatnot and change it into a traditional arcade game. And this was the game called Red Baron, designed again by Harold Montgomery. It's a traditional shooting game. There's a film strip. It shows your targets, and you move the reticle over them, and you press the button, and you shoot them. Again, electromechanical. This is not video games yet. But the company, in terms of its financials, was kind of falling apart. It wasn't really going to sustain itself, but Dave himself was independently wealthy. And so for reasons, they close up Nutting Industries, the company that they had been running, and they open a new company by buying up the assets of Nutting Industries called Milwaukee Coin Industries, along with his partner over here on the right named Dan Winter. And they start reselling Red Baron because they had already been selling it. They had leftover units. They're in the same building, too. So they were it's a whole financial thing. It's not really something that makes sense from the outside. But the company went away. Dave Nutting had the money. He rebought it up. So Milwaukee Coin Industry is no longer going to do any of that quiz stuff. They're going to move straight into traditional arcade games. Well, I say traditional, but they are kind of unique, different arcade games. We have one here called Airball, which is you have a hose, you have a ball that is held up by air, and you get it through hoops and whatnot. And Desert Fox, which is kind of a extension on the Red Baron concept. I do love this picture, by the way. You know, it's one of those herein jukeboxes, but Dave decides that he wants to start looking into different sorts of technology to enhance the arcade games, because these solid-state arcade games, well, if you don't, electromechanical arcade games, if you don't know about electromechanical stuff, see if you can get the guys in the main game hall with one of those 50 pinball machines to open it up for you, because that is a mess inside there. It is quite a sight. But solid-state electronics is stuff that's on circuit boards with chips and all that sort of stuff. Much easier to service, and it's not going to make it ludicrously more expensive either, though maybe in this early 70s period it was a little bit. But nobody he knew had any experience with solid-state electronics. So he decided to go to the University of Milwaukee, and he found this guy named Jeff Fredrickson. And that is how it's spelled there. If any of you have ever known someone named Fredrickson, that is not how it is normally spelled, but yes, Ferdricksen, Jeff Fredrickson. He had been in the military, and he had worked in computers, and he was a bit of a solid-state hardware guy. So he started working summers over at Milwaukee Coin Industries, eventually gets hired in, and he created their first solid-state game called The Safe. And this still has things that's moving around. Again, it's not a video game, it's a safe-cracking game. You move the thing around and the dial, and you work out the combination before the time runs out. It's a pretty interesting game. If anybody has MCI games, make sure to tell me, because I would love to photograph those. But as a result of starting to make these solid-state games, they started to need microchips. And one of their major suppliers of microchips was Intel. And Intel had started to come out with their 4004 microprocessor family. So microprocessors were, starting to make waves in the hobbyist industry, but not a lot of people were using them for large-scale industrial stuff like coin-op. But Dave thought, hey, we can do solid-state, microprocessor-based arcade games, and how about we get into pinball? Now, for those who don't know, pinball was majorly stationed in Chicago, south of Milwaukee, and they had not started to embrace the solid-state era yet. There were a couple sort of loose experiments going on, but microprocessors promised to ignite something very huge in the arcade industry. But he wanted to get into manufacturing this, and MCI had other plans, because MCI had started to open up a series of local area arcades called Red Baron. They were in the local Milwaukee area in a bunch of malls. Mall arcades were starting to take off at this time. And they realized, opening arcades is actually a lot easier and a lot more lucrative than building the arcade machines, which has a lot of overhead and whatnot. We don't want to make arcade games anymore. So they went to Dave Nutting and said, goodbye. You're gone now. Now, it's a funny situation, because Dave actually owned that building, 3404 North Holden Street. He owned the facilities that they were in. Now, he didn't kick him out, but he decided that going independent with Jeff Fredrickson and a couple of other people, he was going to set up in the back of the warehouse and do his engineering stuff there. And since they no longer had a facility that he could manufacture arcade games from, they were going to be a developer to pitch their ideas to other coin-op manufacturers, just like Atari was doing right at the same time. So 1974, he, along with Jeff Fredrickson, and he takes another guy with him named Dwayne Nudston, they found Dave Nutting Associates, and they have a contact with Bally. Bally was interested in exploring the different evolutions of pinball that were coming down the line, so they were like, hey, why don't we give these guys a bit of money and have them try something out? So Jeff and Dave start modifying a flicker pinball table, which wasn't generally available yet at the time. They rip out the guts of it, and they start building their custom little microprocessor-based board here called the Bally Brain. And somebody still has this pinball table, only one of a kind, technical first microprocessor pinball table. If anybody knows who that is, please tell me, because we need this in a museum somewhere. But basically, they take out all the hardwired logic and they replace it with just this very simple board that is just powered by a microprocessor. Then in September 1974, they invite the Bally people down to come and look at this. So they have a normal flicker pinball table on one side. They have it open, all the stuff inside. Then on the other side, they have this. They open it up. There's hardly anything in there. The Bally people are like, you've got to be hiding a mini computer here somewhere. So they start looking in the closet to see if it's hooked up to anything. No, it is powered just by a single microprocessor, a bit of RAM and all that stuff. Basic 4004. So Bally is so impressed, but they don't want to take it right now. Now, Dave Nutting recalls this as they basically didn't want to pay for the patent that he had taken out on this. Though later on, they do buy the patent and the company, so I'm not sure that really makes sense. I think it makes more sense. This was Bally's patent on the microprocessor pinball, and it was just more reliable. Now, the patent gets into a whole court case, which is why I know a lot of these details and whatnot. Dug that up in Chicago. But for the time being, they don't take it. Dave Nutting's like, well, I still want this to be made. I can take it somewhere else. So he goes to an Arizona-based company called Mirko, and they build the Spirit of 76. Now, this is not the Gottlieb table. If you happen to be familiar with pinball, this is a different pinball table. But this design, though it's based on a Motorola chip, is the same as what Dave Nutting brought them. But microprocessors are advancing. And there's a new microprocessor in town. It's called the 8080. And the 8080 is going to absolutely change the future of the arcade industry. But none of them are programmers. They kind of worked out the pinball thing, but they really aren't programmers. So Jeff and Dave, they go back to the University of Milwaukee, and they find this guy who has a robotics course named Robert Nordhaus, and they pluck a few students from there. The most prominent ones being Tom McHugh, who did not give me a photo to show for you, and Jamie Fenton. Jamie Fenton first goes to work on the microprocessor-based home pinball machine version of Fireball, their 1972 pinball table, and that is released sometime in 1976. However, they want to start working on video games because an 8080 is now powerful enough to run a video game because a 4004 was not. And Bally was coming to them and say, hey, we've been importing some games from Japan. Like, we got this one called Speed Race that they later renamed Wheels. And it was made by this guy named Tomohiro Nishikado over at Taito. And it was this very complex, hardwired game. They put it out. It was really successful. But now they have this new game called Western Gun. Western Gun is even more complex. It has humanoid figures and two-screen player action, but they hate what the characters look like. These squat little things here, they are just not impressed with it. They want it to be remade. And since you're already working on this microprocessor video game system, why don't you remake it in that system? And so that's what they do. And that is Gunfight, one of the most important games of the 1970s era. They build this on a board built by Jeff Fredrickson, and it is a very big hit for the time, especially in video games, which were not selling nearly as well as pinball, but it really showcased that there was something to this system. Now, the system that they built, interestingly enough, it was this 8080-based system, and it was basically identical to the system that was later used in Space Invaders. Tomohiro Nishikado has said that he saw Gunfight after he had made Western Gun, and he was impressed with the technology. He didn't like the game, but he was impressed with the technology, and that's what inspired him to go down the road of doing programmable stuff. And that is Space Invaders. The Space Invaders board is basically identical to the Dave Nutting Associates board. Same amount of RAM, same resolution, just tilted because it's a vertical game as opposed to a horizontal game. But it was clearly an influence on this huge hit. Now let's talk a bit about Dave Nutting's kind of role within creating these games. For quite a few people, he was the designer. And he would basically dictate every aspect of the game. He would welcome some thoughts from other people, but with certain people, he would basically design every single thing. Tom McHugh told me about this, that they had a little bit of feedback, but otherwise, Dave Nutting was sending the edicts from on high. And that really worked out for them for their kind of follow-up games in 1976, Seawolf and Tornado Baseball, both also really big hits. Seawolf was even a bigger hit than Gunfight. But not everybody liked this, including a guy named Alan McNeil. Alan McNeil, who we'll talk about in a second what he did, he was a programmer at Dave Nutting Associates, and he had programmed a couple of their sequel games, like the sequels to Seawolf and Gunfight, and he wanted to make his own original stuff. But Dave Nutting was like, oh no, you don't have the experience for that, you don't know what game design's all about. He didn't like that. He quit. He went to Universal Research Laboratories, which is later bought by Stern Electronics, which is not Stern Pinball, and he creates the game Berserk. And now, your interesting fun fact for the day. You know this guy right here? Little smiley face. Anybody know his name? Evil Otto is his name. And Evil Otto is named after a guy who I will charitably call Jeff Fredrickson's assistant at Dave Nutting Associates, named Dave Otto. He was formerly a bus driver, and later he became one of the managers at Dave Nutting Associates. So if you're not aware with any of these Bally games that are earlier, maybe you're familiar with Berserk, and that has its own Dave Nutting influence. Now, they started building a new system after their 8080 boards based on the Z80, and they leveraged this into creating a home console called the Bally Professional Arcade. Now, this is a whole story in and of itself. We don't really have the time to get fully into this. Maybe you can ask me at the end here. Get Kevin Bunch up here next time, and he'll do a presentation on the Bally Professional Arcade. But it was a very advanced system for its time, in full color, $300. It had a chance to be something, but it was not, though it became a big platform for indie games. But it was this very impressive piece of technology, which was also part of their basis for their other hits of the late 1970s. 280 Zap, which was a clone of a German game, Clowns, which was a clone of Circus, and Amazing Maze, which was an original game, but it's really weird. So if you get the chance to play Amazing Maze, try it out. And they could churn out sequels, too, like Boot Hill to Gunfight, Seawolf 2, and Extra Innings, sequel to Tornado Baseball. So they were proven hit makers. So in 1976, they moved down closer to Bally. They moved down to Arlington Heights, Illinois. And then in 1977, they are purchased by Bally, and they become an official part of the Bally overlordship. You know, their games were putting out through Midway, which was owned by Bally, but now Dave Nutting Associates is the major in-house developer for Bally, and they set up in this building here in Arlington Heights, Illinois. So technically, it's no longer a Milwaukee story, but you know, that was my way to get you in here. But you see, not everybody wanted to move down to Chicago area, Arlington Heights. In fact, Tom McHugh, their major game creator, decided, I am just going to stay here in Milwaukee. So he actually was a pioneer of what we all learned last year of remote working. So he stayed in Milwaukee. Dave would drive up. There's no FTP, no nothing. He just had to hand off the discs. And he programmed Wizard of War, all completely remotely. And that, too, was a minor hit. But, of course, Bally's biggest hits were coming in from elsewhere. But a couple other Dave Nutting Associates games include Gorf by Jamie Fenton and also The Adventures of Robbie Roto. Both of these were kind of an appeal to the Japanese side of the industry in a lot of ways. So they were trying to change with the times, but they just weren't living up to the Pac-Mans and the Space Invaders and the Galaxians and all that. Again, all that stuff put out under Midway. And so they started to decrease in relevance. Midway started to have its own internal development team that they were working with, and ultimately they were kind of squeezed out of everything, but not before they created their final game, Professor Pac-Man. Professor Pac-Man is not a very good game, but it is interesting in the sense that it is a combination of Dave's original entry into the industry through quiz games, and then what he helped pioneer through microprocessor video games. So Dave Nutting eventually leaves the industry. The whole patent case is still ongoing when they actually close up Dave Nutting Associates and everything. He goes to Colorado. He builds his own personal helicopter. So he was always an inventor all the way up until the end. And he does that for a couple of years. And eventually, he decides he wants to get back into the industry with a company called Dave Nutting Games. But he doesn't go back and create video games or quiz games. He decides to create batting cage games. So this one called Batter Up. So it's funny that, you know, he revolutionized all the way one way, and then he swung back all the way the other way to something that was available in the 1920s. But ultimately, that didn't work out for him. They only put out, I'm not sure this was the only game they put out, but it might be the only game they put out. So Dave Nutting Games goes away rather quickly. He moves to Arizona, which was, funnily enough, also where his brother Bill lived during the last years of his life. And he was inventing up until the end. One of the things he told me he was working on was a something for tractors to keep tumbleweeds out of the blades and whatnot. So he did pass away last year, September 23rd. I did have the chance to talk with him via email, but he is definitely an inventor worth knowing. And if you want to, if you're someone who is interested in arcade game designers, Dave Nutting is absolutely a name that should be on your lips. So that is it. Thank you all very much for coming to this presentation.
Yeah, give it up for Ethan Johnson.
So I'm Ethan Johnson, the history of how we play at WordPress.com. If you want to find some of my more work, I have at Game Research E here on Twitter, and also working on the arcade documentary Arcade Dreams at arcadedocumentary.com.